In a town where silence was a sanctuary, one violent slap was about to awaken a ghost. Ethan Mercer took the blow without a word, blood staining his lip as his daughter watched her world crumble in fear. The thug named Derek Vance laughed, circling his prey like a wolf sensing weakness. "What's wrong, Grease Monkey? Too scared to fight back in front of your little princess?" Every customer looked away. No one moved. But behind that tired flannel shirt, something cold was surfacing a side of him that had been buried for 3 long years. His oil-stained hands, the same hands that fixed old engines and braided Rosie's hair every morning, now rested perfectly still on the table. The thug saw a broken mechanic, but he didn't realize those hands once signed death warrants for an empire. He didn't know that the man sitting before him had built an empire on blood and silence, ruling half the criminal world before vanishing like smoke. And he certainly didn't know that touching Rosie would be the last mistake he ever made. The Silent King had been sleeping in the shadows of Millbrook, but today, the king was forced to remember how to destroy. If this breathtaking moment sends a shiver through you, tap like and share it with someone who needs to feel this energy. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss a single breathtaking moment, because the king is awakening, and you wouldn't want to miss what's about to happen next. 2 hours earlier, the bright Saturday morning sunlight poured through the front windows of Rosa's cafe, casting golden rectangles across the worn wooden floor and the checkered tables faded by years of use. The smell of fresh coffee blended with the warm sweetness of waffles just out of the iron, filling the small space and mingling with the soft conversations of a dozen scattered patrons. An elderly couple sat in the far corner, sharing a newspaper, coffee rings marking a menu they had stopped reading many years ago. Near the back door, a young mother struggled with a small child and a towering plate of pancakes, her patience thinning but her smile still intact. This was the heartbeat of small-town America, a place where everyone knew everyone, and a stranger was noticed the moment they walked in. Ethan Mercer sat in his usual booth by the window, the cracked vinyl seat no one else wanted, quietly watching his daughter Rosie carefully arrange marshmallows in her cup of hot chocolate into the shape of a tiny house. Her small fingers worked with intense concentration, the tip of her tongue peeking out slightly as she placed each soft white piece in exactly the right spot with the precision of an architect. Morning light caught in Rosie's blonde hair, turning it the color of honey, and Ethan felt the familiar ache in his chest, the kind that came from loving something so completely it frightened him. At 37, Ethan looked exactly like what he presented to the world, a working man with calloused hands and tired eyes. His flannel shirt was faded but clean, his jeans softened by years of engine oil and sweat. There were scars on his hands, he told people, came from work accidents, and that was true for the newer ones. The older scars, the lines along his knuckles and forearms, those carried different stories he never told. The gray strands threading through his dark hair had appeared almost overnight 3 years earlier, right around the time his world collapsed. He ran a small repair shop on the edge of town now, fixing old engines for neighbors and occasionally for someone from the city who wanted something reliable and real. His hands, which once counted blood, stained cash, and signed death sentences in the shadows, now dismantled carburetors and changed oil. It was honest work, quiet work, the kind that let him be home when Rosie stepped off the bus each afternoon, that let him pack her lunches and help with homework, and read to her until she fell asleep. Rosie looked up from her marshmallow creation with a gap-toothed smile that stopped Ethan's heart every time he saw it. She had her mother's eyes, an impossible green like new leaves catching sunlight, and her mother's stubborn chin, Catherine's chin, the same chin that once argued with him about everything from what color to paint the nursery to whether he should leave the empire behind. She had won that argument with logic, with love, and with the look she gave him, the look that said she knew exactly who he was and loved him anyway. Rosie hugged Mr. Buttons to her chest, the worn brown teddy bear with one eye stitched back on twice. It was the last gift Catherine had given their daughter before everything ended. "Daddy, look," Rosie said proudly, lifting the cup. "This is Mr. Button's house. It has a bedroom and a living room and even a kitchen." Something cracked inside Ethan, as it always did when Rosie said things like that without knowing how deeply they cut. He reached across the table and brushed a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, his rough fingers impossibly gentle against her soft cheek. "That's a very beautiful house," he said quietly. "Mr. Buttons is lucky to have such a good architect." Rosie giggled and hugged the bear tighter. "Mr. Buttons says I'm his best friend, and you're his second best friend." Ethan smiled, a rare expression that softened the steel in his gray eyes. "I'll take second place." The bell over the cafe door rang, and Ethan's gaze snapped automatically toward the entrance. An old habit from another life, one he couldn't shake no matter how many peaceful years piled up. His body assessed the threat before his mind caught up. Just an elderly woman with an oversized purse. He let out a breath and turned back to his daughter. To the marshmallow house. To the golden light and the fragile peace he had traded an entire empire to claim. As Rosie leaned down and gently blew across her cup of chocolate to cool it, Ethan stared out the window, and the memories surged back like an unstoppable tide. 9 years earlier, he hadn't been a mechanic in this small town. 9 years earlier, Ethan Mercer had sat in a penthouse overlooking Manhattan, controlling an underground empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars with nods and midnight phone calls. People called him the Silent King because of how he dealt with his enemies. No loud threats, no shouted boasts, only silence and action. Traitors vanished without a sound. Rivals woke up with a horse's head in their bed, or didn't wake up at all. He was 28, and the entire East Coast underworld bowed to him. But even kings had rules. Ethan didn't touch women or children, didn't traffic people, didn't sell drugs to students. He was a monster, but a monster with principles. Then Catherine appeared. She was a human rights lawyer who crossed his path at a charity fundraiser he financed to launder money. She wore a simple black dress among glittering gowns, drank water while everyone else sipped champagne, and when he approached with the charming smile that had conquered hundreds, she looked straight into his eyes and said, "I know who you are, Ethan Mercer." The room seemed to stop breathing. He was used to fear, used to flattery, used to averted gazes. But Catherine looked at him as if she were reading every page of a book he had hidden his entire life. Then she said the thing that turned his world upside down. "I don't see a monster. I see a man trying not to become one." They married a year later. Rosie was born another year after that. The first time he held his daughter in the hospital, when her tiny hand wrapped around his finger and refused to let go, Ethan understood he couldn't keep ruling the darkness. He began handing over power piece by piece, as carefully as dismantling a bomb. Catherine said he was like a dragon choosing to stop breathing fire. Still dangerous, but choosing gentleness. 3 years earlier, on an ordinary afternoon like any other, Catherine drove to pick Rosie up from preschool. Ethan was at home, fixing the old bicycle he had bought for his daughter, whistling a meaningless tune. The phone rang. A stranger's voice. Gunshots. His wife. The preschool. He didn't remember how he drove there. He only remembered Catherine lying on the sidewalk, red blood spreading across the floral dress she had worn that morning, her green eyes still open but seeing nothing anymore. The teacher held Rosie inside the car, covering her eyes, but it was too late. His daughter had seen. The police said it was a random shooting. Ethan knew there was nothing random in his world. Someone had sent a message, whether the real target was him or not. That night, when Rosie finally fell asleep after hours of crying in his arms, Ethan sat beside his wife's coffin and cried for the first time since he was 12, since the day his father taught him that tears were a luxury men like them weren't allowed to have. He tortured dozens of people to find who had given the order. Every trail led to Frank Castellano, a rival boss whose brother Ethan had killed 5 years earlier, but there was no direct proof, no string he could grab and pull. Then he realized a painful truth. Even if he killed Castellano, even if he burned the entire underworld to the ground, there would always be someone else. Rosie would always be a target. His daughter would grow up in fear, looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next bullet, unless he disappeared. 2 months after the funeral, Ethan Mercer died in a spectacular car explosion on the Brooklyn Bridge. A charred, unidentifiable body was pulled from the wreckage. Newspapers reported the collapse of an empire. The underworld divided the scraps he left behind. No one knew that Ethan had paid $2 million for a corpse from a morgue, had moved all his assets into untraceable accounts, had bought a new identity and a repair shop in the town of Millbrook, where no one asked too many questions. The Silent King died. Ethan Cross, a widowed mechanic with a young daughter, was born. For 3 years, he believed that if he stayed quiet enough, small enough, ordinary enough, the past would leave him alone. For 3 years, he was wrong. Ethan pulled himself back from the abyss of memory when a gentle voice cut through his thoughts. "Sorry to keep you both waiting. The cafe's busier than usual today." He looked up to see Clara Ashford standing at the table with 2 plates of pancakes in her hands, a warm smile on her lips, even as her hazel eyes reflected a deeper fatigue than a long shift alone could explain. She was 27, with brown hair tied up high, a few loose strands framing her delicate face, and a dark brown leather bracelet always worn on her left wrist, no matter the weather. Ethan had noticed that bracelet from the very first time he and Rosie came to the cafe 2 years earlier. Noticed the way Clara would unconsciously tug it lower whenever someone stared too long. He recognized the marks of old wounds when he saw them. He had enough of his own to compare. Clara set the pancakes down in front of Rosie, and Ethan's eyes widened just a little when he saw she had drawn a bear's face in chocolate on top, complete with round ears and a squinting smile. "This is a special pancake for Mr. Buttons and his very best friend," Clara said as she crouched to Rosie's eye level, her voice solemn as if discussing matters of national importance. "I heard Mr. Buttons likes bears, so I drew him a friend." Rosie's mouth fell open, her green eyes lighting up in a way Ethan had rarely seen since Catherine died. Rosie was usually quiet with strangers, retreating into the safe shell she shared with Mr. Buttons, refusing to speak to anyone but her father. The therapist said it was a trauma response, that it would take time, that patience was essential. But now Rosie was smiling, lifting Mr. Buttons for Clara to see. "He says he really likes it. He wants you to be his friend." Clara didn't miss a beat. She reached out and solemnly shook the paw of the worn teddy bear. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Buttons. I'm Clara. I hear you're the best friend in the world." Rosie giggled, the sound like wind chimes on a spring morning, and Ethan felt his throat tighten. How long had it been since he'd heard that laugh? How long since his daughter had laughed with anyone but him? He watched Clara, truly watched her for the first time, not as a customer watching a server, but as a man trying to understand how she had reached his daughter when the rest of the world had failed. She moved with the easy grace of someone used to hard work, her hands quick and steady as she refilled his coffee without asking. She remembered he drank it black with no sugar, though he'd never said a word. She remembered Rosie liked her hot chocolate with more marshmallows than the rules allowed. Small details most servers didn't bother to keep track of. Rosa Martinez, the 60-year-old owner with silver hair and a gentle smile, had told Ethan about Clara a few months earlier. Orphaned young, raised in the foster system, moved from one home to another until she turned 18 and stepped out on her own with nothing but a backpack and a stubborn refusal to break. She worked to support herself, paid her own rent, and studied at night for an early childhood education degree because she wanted to do something that mattered. Rosa said her heart was bigger than her circumstances. Ethan watched as Clara quietly slipped an extra cookie into the jacket pocket of a small boy at the next table, a child with torn shoes and an oversized shirt that was clearly a donation. She did it quickly and discreetly, so smoothly that no one else noticed, not even the mother absorbed in her phone. It wasn't the first time Ethan had seen Clara do that. She had a habit of helping in silence, without needing thanks, without wanting recognition, as if she knew exactly what hunger felt like and didn't want any child to endure it. Clara returned to their table and set down a small extra cup of chocolate topped with a heart of whipped cream. "This one's on the house," she winked at Rosie. "Because Mr. Buttons is a very special customer." Then she straightened and met Ethan's gaze, and for a brief moment something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. Two people with hidden scars seeing each other in a crowded room. Clara dipped her head and turned away to serve another table, but Ethan noticed her hand tremble slightly when a male customer looked at her for too long. He saw the way she swallowed and kept smiling as if nothing were wrong. She was stronger than her circumstances. But everyone had limits. The bell over the cafe door rang, and this time when Ethan looked toward the entrance, his body went rigid. 3 men walked in, and the atmosphere inside Rosa's cafe shifted completely. The peace Ethan had carefully built for 3 years finally collided with the reality he had been trying to escape. The man leading the group was the same one who had just shattered the morning silence, Derek Vance, and he walked into the cafe as if he owned it. No, as if he owned the entire town and everyone in it. In his late 20s, tall with slicked back hair set with expensive gel, he wore a glossy black leather jacket and a gold chain that caught the overhead lights. The white sneakers on his feet probably cost more than a month of Clara's wages. Shoes that had never known an honest day's work. His face carried the kind of good looks common to men who had been indulged their whole lives, but his eyes were different. The eyes of someone who had never been denied anything, who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Ethan recognized those eyes. He had seen them in the mirror 10 years earlier, before Catherine taught him that power didn't mean permission to do anything you wanted. 2 men followed Derek like satellites orbiting a planet. Tommy and Jake, Ethan guessed, from fragments of gossip he had picked up around town. Both were smaller and quieter, their eyes darting around the cafe with the restless energy of followers who were no longer entirely sure they wanted to follow, but didn't know how to stop. Everyone in Millbrook knew Derek Vance, the sheriff's son, raised with a silver spoon and the belief that the law applied to other people, not to him. Complaints about Derek always vanished before reaching anyone with real authority. His victims learned to stay silent. That was how things worked here, and Ethan hated it with every fiber of the body that had once ruled the underworld, where at least there had been a brutal kind of justice, but a consistent one. Ethan turned back to Rosie, forcing himself to focus on his daughter instead of the men who had just entered. But his body had already shifted into alert mode, assessing threats automatically. 3 targets, 1 aggressive leader, 2 uncertain followers. Front door, 5 meters away. Back exit through the kitchen, 12 meters away. A butter knife on the table that could serve in an emergency. He shoved the calculations down, hating himself that they still came as naturally as breathing. "Hey, sweetheart." Derek's voice carried loud enough for the whole cafe to hear, his tone stretched sweet like honey laced with poison. "Looking extra pretty today. Anyone ever tell you that you should smile more?" Ethan glanced toward the counter and saw Clara standing there, her body stiffening almost imperceptibly. The service smile was still in place on her lips, but it no longer reached her eyes. Her hands clenched the tray unconsciously, knuckles white. "Hello, Derek," Clara said, her voice calm and professional enough that Ethan silently admired her. "What can I get you today?" Derek stepped closer, deliberately invading her personal space. "I want your phone number with my coffee. Or maybe you'd rather have dinner with me. My place has a great view." Clara took half a step back until her spine touched the counter. "Thank you, but I'm here to serve drinks only. What size coffee would you like?" Tommy and Jake snickered behind him as if this were the best comedy they had ever seen. Derek didn't laugh. His eyes narrowed, unused to being refused, disliking the feeling, especially in front of his men. "Playing hard to get?" He tilted his head, lowering his voice but keeping it audible. "I like that, but you should know who I am before you say no. Everyone around here knows my dad." Rosa came out from the kitchen, her eyes sharpening at the scene before her. "Derek, this is my diner. Please behave yourself or leave." Derek turned to her with a smile that never touched his eyes. "Mrs. Rosa, you should teach your staff how to treat VIP customers. My dad would be very disappointed to hear your place might have some food safety issues that need inspecting." Rosa fell silent, her jaw tightening, but she said nothing more. She had lived in this town long enough to know which battles could be won and which only brought suffering. Ethan felt Rosie press closer to him. She had stopped eating her pancakes and was clutching Mr. Buttons tightly, her green eyes worried as she watched the counter. "Daddy," she whispered. "Why is that man talking so loud?" "It's okay, sweetheart," Ethan said gently, one hand rubbing her back. "Just grown-ups talking. Keep eating." But his eyes never left Derek Vance. And somewhere deep inside him, the part he had buried for 3 years, began to stir. Derek seemed to lose interest in his game with Clara when she continued to refuse him with cool politeness. He turned away, his gaze sweeping the diner like a predator searching for a new target, and his eyes settled on the booth by the window, on Ethan in his old flannel shirt and oil-stained hands, on Rosie with her worn teddy bear and the bare-faced pancake on her plate. Derek smiled, the smile of someone who had just found his next amusement. He walked toward their table, Tommy and Jake trailing behind like loyal shadows. Each of Derek's steps echoed across the wooden floor like a countdown. Ethan felt his muscles tighten, the old instinct screaming in his head. Assess the target. Identify weaknesses. Prepare to act. But he forced it down, pushed it deeper, because Rosie was sitting there with green eyes already shimmering with fear. "Who do we have here?" Derek stopped beside the table, his voice loud enough for the whole cafe to hear. "A mechanic, right? I've seen you at that rundown shop out there. I can smell the engine oil from here." Ethan looked up, his gray eyes meeting Derek's. For a brief moment, something flickered in his gaze, something ancient and dangerous, and Derek hesitated for half a beat, as if his survival instincts were trying to warn him of something his mind could not process. Then the moment passed. Ethan lowered his eyes, his voice low and steady. "We don't want trouble. Please leave us alone." Derek laughed, the sound sharp like shattering glass. "Don't want trouble?" He leaned forward, one hand braced on the table right beside Rosie's cup of chocolate. "Look at you, scared like a mouse. Got a kid sitting here and you still can't lift your head." Rosie shrank back, pressing against the seat, clutching Mr. Buttons so tightly the old stitches creaked. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. And Derek heard her. "Oh, the little princess is calling her daddy," he sneered. "Your daddy can't help you, sweetheart. Your daddy's a coward." Before Ethan could blink, Derek's hand flashed out in a sharp backhand, The slap echoed through the crowded cafe like a gunshot, sending Ethan's head snapping to the side. He sat frozen, blood trickling from his split lip, while Rosie watched in terror. Then, with a cruel smirk, Derek's hand swept out again, and Rosie's cup of chocolate tipped over, soaking the table. The hot brown liquid spilled across the table, soaking into napkins, running over the edge, and dripping onto the floor. The marshmallows Rosie had carefully arranged into a house for Mr. Buttons floated in the puddle like shattered dreams. Rosie screamed, the raw sound of a 6-year-old watching her small world fall apart. Mr. Buttons slipped from her hands in the panic, landing on the floor at Derek's feet, and Derek, with a smile devoid of remorse, stepped down. There was a soft tearing sound as the sole of his expensive shoe crushed the old teddy bear into the wooden floor. "He's my friend," Rosie sobbed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mommy gave him to me. Mommy gave him to me." Ethan's heart shattered into a million pieces. Inside him, the silent king roared for blood, demanding release, demanding to tear apart the man who had made his daughter cry. He could do it. He could stand up right now and end Derek Vance in 3 seconds. A strike to the throat to cut off the scream. A knee into the 7th and 8th ribs. An elbow to the temple. Derek would never stand again. Tommy and Jake would run before they even understood what had happened. But then Rosie would see. His daughter would see her father become a monster. She would remember it forever, just as she still remembered her mother lying on the sidewalk. Ethan would save her from Derek, but lose her in another way. She would fear him. She would look at him with the same eyes Catherine had the first time she truly saw him. Eyes that saw a monster. He couldn't bear that. Ethan swallowed his fury like broken glass, each shard slicing his throat on the way down. He bent to pick up Mr. Buttons, brushing dust from the bear with hands shaking from restraint, and placed it back into Rosie's arms. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said, his voice so calm it surprised even him. "It's okay." Derek looked down at him with undisguised contempt. "See that, kid? Your daddy's a coward. He won't do anything." Clara rushed over with towels, dropping to her knees beside Rosie and pulling the sobbing child into her arms. Ethan looked at her, looked at his daughter, and held the monster inside his chest tight. Not yet, he told himself. Not yet. Derek thought he had won. He stood there with a triumphant smile, looking down at a man who hadn't fought back, and a child crying in a server's arms. The entire cafe fell silent, the other patrons lowering their heads to their tables, pretending to see nothing, hear nothing, know nothing. That was how this town worked. That was how Derek Vance always won. But he wasn't satisfied. Men like Derek never knew when to stop. Never understood that there were lines that should never be crossed. He tilted his head, studying Rosie sobbing in Clara's arms, and something cruel flashed in his eyes. "Cute kid," Derek said slowly, each word dripping like acid. "Green eyes, blonde hair." He licked his lips. "Maybe I should keep her for a while. Teach her daddy what respect for his betters looks like." The cafe froze. Clara clutched Rosie tighter, her eyes wide with terror. Rosa stood behind the counter with her hand over her mouth. Tommy and Jake exchanged uneasy glances, as if even they knew Derek had gone too far. Ethan didn't move. He sat there with his eyes lowered to the chocolate-smeared table, and for a moment it seemed as if he had accepted his fate, as if he would let Derek do whatever he wanted. "Come on," Derek laughed, reaching toward Rosie. "Come here with me. I promise I'll take good care of you, sweetheart." Derek's fingers never reached her. Ethan moved. No one saw him stand. No one saw him step past Clara. One instant he was sitting in the booth. The next he was between Derek and his daughter. One hand locked around Derek's wrist with a grip so tight bone cracked beneath skin. The room locked in place. Derek's mouth opened to scream, but the sound died in his throat when he looked into Ethan's eyes. Because they were no longer the eyes of a mechanic. The gray had turned to cold steel, like frozen water hiding a lethal abyss beneath. There was no anger there, no emotion at all. Only the emptiness of a man who had killed so many times that killing one more meant nothing. Those were the eyes of the Silent King. The eyes Mafia bosses had seen just before their empires collapsed. The eyes Ethan's enemies saw last before the darkness swallowed them whole. "You just made a mistake." Ethan's voice wasn't loud. He didn't shout. It didn't even sound threatening in the usual way. It was low, cold, and steady, like a hammer driving nails into a coffin. That calm was what made it terrifying. That absence of emotion was what made Derek feel something he had never felt in his life. Fear. Real fear. "Who are you?" Derek whispered, his wrist still trapped in Ethan's steel grip. Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if considering an insect before deciding whether to crush it. I'm the man you never touch a daughter around. Tommy and Jake took an involuntary step back. Clara turned away, holding Rosie tight, and the air inside Rosa's cafe grew heavy and suffocating, like the moment before a storm, like the silence before an explosion. The Silent King had awakened, and hell was about to open its doors. 4 seconds. That was all it took to completely shatter Derek Vance's understanding of how the universe worked. 4 seconds for 3 confident men to walk into a cafe like predators and end up sprawled on the floor like butchered animals. The first second began with the agonizing grind of Derek's already shattered wrist as Ethan increased the pressure. Ethan didn't twist or jerk. He simply squeezed. Pressure focused on a single point with the precision of an engineer and the cruelty of an executioner. Derek opened his mouth to scream, but Ethan was faster. His free hand struck straight into the throat, with just enough force to paralyze the vocal cords without crushing the windpipe. The only sound that escaped Derek's mouth was a wet, strangled wheeze as he folded inward, eyes rolling back from pain and lack of oxygen. Ethan gave a small push, nothing more than the effort it took to move an inconvenient piece of furniture, and Derek collapsed onto the floor as if someone had pulled every bone out of his body. The second belonged to Tommy. The follower reacted on instinct, charging Ethan with a raised fist and a battle cry he had probably learned from action movies. It was a mistake. Ethan didn't block the punch. He stepped aside with the fluid grace of a dancer, letting Tommy's momentum carry him forward, then added a precise shove to the back of his neck. Tommy's head struck the corner of the nearest table with a dull, heavy sound like a melon hitting concrete. He went down instantly, blood beginning to flow from a split on his forehead, unconscious before his body even reached the floor. A coffee cup on the table trembled once, then settled. Not a single drop spilled. The 3rd second was for Jake. The last of the trio panicked completely, his shaking hand pulling a switchblade from his back pocket and slashing wildly toward Ethan. The blade flashed under the cafe lights, reflecting the warped, terrified face of the man holding it. Ethan looked at the knife the way one looks at a child holding a toy weapon. There was no contempt in his eyes, only absolute emptiness. Jake lunged, a clumsy thrust aimed at Ethan's stomach. Ethan simply turned, his left hand knocking the knife wrist outward, while his right elbow struck the inside of Jake's arm at a precise angle. The limb bent backward in a way arms were never meant to bend, and Jake's scream was cut short as Ethan continued the motion, spinning 180 degrees and driving his other elbow into Jake's temple. Jake collapsed like a building brought down in a controlled demolition, floor by floor, knees hitting first, then the rest of his body following. The knife slipped from his hand and skidded across the floor, coming to rest beneath a table. No one moved to retrieve it. The 4th second was silence. Ethan stood among 3 bodies still breathing, his own breathing unchanged, as if he had merely stood up to refill his coffee rather than disabling 3 men in less than 5 seconds. There wasn't a bead of sweat on his forehead, not a tremor in his body. This wasn't a fight. This was target neutralization. This was work. Rosa's cafe was frozen in deathly silence. The elderly couple dropped their coffee cups, brown liquid spilling across the table without anyone noticing. The young mother clutched her child, covering the child's eyes even though everything was already over. Rosa stood behind the counter with eyes wide in disbelief, lips moving in whispered prayers in Spanish. Clara still held Rosie, her body shielding the girl from seeing anything, but her hazel eyes never left Ethan. There was no fear in that gaze, only shock, understanding, and something that looked very much like respect. Ethan walked to where Derek lay curled on the floor, clutching his shattered wrist and struggling to breathe through a bruised throat. He knelt slowly, like a father kneeling to speak to a child, and tilted his head as he looked at the man who had believed himself king of this small town. Derek looked up, and what he saw in Ethan's eyes made him tremble harder than the physical pain ever could. Ethan leaned in, his lips only centimeters from Derek's ear, and whispered in a voice meant for only the 2 of them. "Tell your boss the Silent King is still alive." Derek's eyes widened in pure terror, recognition breaking over him like a blood-soaked dawn. He knew that name. Everyone in the underworld did. "And if anyone comes near my daughter again," Ethan continued, his voice never changing in volume, "I won't stop at broken bones. I'll come for every person you know, every person you love, every person you've ever spoken to. And when I'm done, no one will remember you ever existed." Ethan stood, turned his back on Derek's shaking body, and walked toward his daughter. The steel in his gray eyes melted instantly when he saw Rosie, as if two completely different men lived inside the same body. He knelt in front of Clara and Rosie, gently took Mr. Buttons from his daughter's hands, and brushed the dust from the teddy bear once more, as if it were the most important thing in the world. "It's all right now, Angel," he said, his voice so tender the witnesses couldn't believe it belonged to the same man who had taken down 3 men in 4 seconds. "Daddy's here. Daddy will always be here." Rosie wrapped her arms around his neck and cried, but these were tears of relief, not fear. And Ethan held his daughter, his eyes looking past her shoulder toward the window, toward the outside world he knew would never leave him alone again. The king had awakened, and the entire kingdom would soon know it. 15 minutes later, the wail of police sirens tore through the quiet of Millbrook. 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of Rosa's cafe, red and blue lights flashing through the windows like bleeding wounds. Deputy Sheriff Martinez walked in, not Howard Vance, and Ethan silently thanked whatever small mercy that was. Martinez was one of the rare honest men on the force, one of the few not in the Vance family's pocket. He took in the 3 groaning bodies on the floor, then Ethan sitting calmly in the booth with Rosie in his arms, and his eyebrows lifted but he didn't speak. Rosa was the first to break the silence, her voice strong and clear, leaving no room for doubt. "They came in here harassing my diner, harassing my staff, and threatening a 6-year-old child. This man acted in self-defense. I and 20 other people here will testify to that." Clara stood beside the owner, her chin lifted, hazel eyes steady as she looked straight at the deputy. "Derek Vance threatened to kidnap Ethan's daughter. He said he would keep her to teach her father a lesson. Everyone in the diner heard it. A few other patrons began to nod, braver now that Derek lay helpless on a stretcher. "That's right," the old man in the corner booth spoke up. "That punk threatened the kid. The man was just protecting his daughter." Martinez scanned the room, wrote a few notes in his pad, then nodded at Ethan. "You can take your daughter home. We'll contact you if we need more information. But from what I see here, this was justified self-defense." Ethan stood, Rosie still clinging to his neck with Mr. Buttons pressed between them. He carried her toward the door, passing Derek as the paramedics lifted him onto the stretcher. Their eyes met one last time, and Ethan saw pure fear in the gaze of the man who had believed himself untouchable. "Good. Let that fear haunt him." Clara hurried after them, the teddy bear cleaned of chocolate stains in her hands. "Wait," she called, slightly out of breath. "Mr. Buttons." I cleaned him up for her. Ethan stopped and turned. In the morning sunlight pouring through the glass, Clara looked more fragile than he had realized, and stronger too. She didn't shake. She didn't look away. She simply held out the bear to Rosie with a gentle smile. "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice rougher than he intended, "for protecting her when I couldn't." Clara shook her head. "You were the one who protected her. I just held her." She hesitated, then added softly, "She'll be okay, right?" Ethan looked down at his daughter, her blonde hair damp with tears against his shoulder. "I'll make sure of it," he said, a promise more to himself than to Clara. He carried Rosie to the car, settled her into the back seat with the care one uses for something more precious than any treasure, placed Mr. Buttons back in her arms, and watched as she clutched the bear as if afraid it could be taken again. Ethan got behind the wheel, started the engine, and backed out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, he saw Clara still standing in the doorway, watching them go. And behind her, farther down the street, a black car idled at the corner, engine running, no one getting out. Ethan memorized the license plate and kept driving. "Daddy." Rosie's voice came from the back seat, small and shaky. "Do you know how to fight?" Ethan glanced at her in the mirror, his chest tightening at the sight of her red-rimmed green eyes. "I do, Angel. I learned a long time ago." "Like a superhero, Daddy?" He wanted to smile but couldn't. "No, sweetheart, I'm not a superhero. Superheroes don't make people bleed. I'm just a dad, and I'll never let anyone hurt you." Rosie was quiet for a moment, hugging Mr. Buttons closer. "Daddy," she finally said, her voice heavy with sleep after so many tears. "I love you, even when you fight people." Ethan's throat closed. "I love you too, Rosie, more than anything in this world." In the rearview mirror, the black car was still following them, holding a distance of 3 cars, professional and patient. Ethan knew exactly who they were. He knew the time of peace was over. Night fell over the town of Millbrook like a black shroud. Ethan sat in the living room without turning on the lights, his back against the old sofa, eyes fixed on the window where streetlights cast pale yellow streaks across the lawn outside. Rosie had been asleep since 7 in the evening, exhausted after a day filled with too many tears and too much fear. He had stayed beside her until her breathing evened out, until her small fingers loosened their grip around Mr. Buttons, until he was certain no nightmare waited to claim her in her sleep. Now he sat alone with the darkness and the thoughts he had tried to bury for 3 years. The old phone lay on the table in front of him, its black screen like an eye waiting to open. Inside it was a number he hadn't called since the day he died on the Brooklyn Bridge. Raymond Brooks, his right hand for 15 years. The only man he had ever trusted besides Catherine. Ethan thought about the black car that had followed him from the cafe all the way to the end of this street before turning away. He thought about the way Derek Vance had looked at him the moment he walked into the diner, the gaze of someone searching for a specific target, not a random victim. He thought about the way Derek had checked his phone more than once inside the cafe, as if waiting for confirmation from someone else. Derek Vance wasn't a random thug. He was a piece placed carefully on the board to provoke a reaction, and Ethan had reacted exactly the way they wanted. Someone knew he was still alive. Someone had found him. And someone had sent Derek to confirm it, to provoke him, to force the Silent King into the open. Castellano. The name rang through Ethan's mind like a death bell. Frank Castellano, the boss he had suspected of standing behind Catherine's death but had never been able to prove. He had waited 3 years, patient as an old spider, spinning his web and waiting for the prey to reveal itself. And now the prey had moved. Ethan closed his eyes, and Catherine's voice filled his head as if she were sitting beside him. "I know who you are," she had said the night before their wedding, when he tried one last time to push her away, to tell her to find a normal man worthy of her. "I know what you've done, and I still choose you. Not because I'm naive, but because I see the man you can become." He had become that man because of her. He had given up the kingdom, the power, everything he once thought defined him. He had learned how to braid his daughter's hair, how to make pancakes on Sunday mornings, how to read fairy tales with different voices for every character. He had become a father, but Catherine had said something else in the days before she was taken from him. "I'm not asking you to be someone else. I'm only asking you not to let our daughter grow up afraid of the dark," he had promised. And he had kept that promise for 3 years. But now the darkness was coming for his daughter, and he couldn't pretend it didn't exist anymore. Ethan opened his eyes and looked down at his hands in the dim light. The hands that had braided Rosie's hair that morning. The hands that had crushed Derek Vance's wrist that afternoon. The same hands. The same man. Catherine had once said he was like a dragon choosing to stop breathing fire. Still dangerous, but choosing gentleness. But there were moments when the dragon had to breathe fire again, not because it wanted to burn the world, but because it was the only way to protect what it loved. Ethan had 2 choices. One was to run, change identities again, tear Rosie away from this house, from the school she had just begun to feel safe in, from Clara and Rosa and the people who had become family. Keep running until Castellano found him again, then run again, and keep running forever. Let Rosie grow up without roots, without friends, without memories of a place called home. The other choice was to confront it, to step back into the world he had left behind, face the ghost he had buried, and end it all once and for all. So Rosie could grow up without looking over her shoulder, without fearing every knock on the door, without losing anyone else. What would Catherine want him to choose? He already knew the answer. She would want him to protect their daughter at any cost, even if that cost was becoming a monster again. Ethan picked up the phone, found Raymond's number, and pressed call. 2 rings. 3. Then a familiar voice answered, rough with disbelief. "People say you're dead." Ethan stared out the window at the darkness waiting beyond the glass. "I need one last job, Ray. After that, you can bury me for real." Silence stretched for a few seconds before Raymond replied, his voice steady again as if 3 years had never passed. "Castellano." Everything connected to him. Raymond exhaled on the other end, and Ethan could picture the 50-year-old man nodding slowly, sharp eyes lighting with something close to relief. "I've been waiting for this call for 3 years. Boss, I'll be in Millbrook before dawn." The next morning, Ethan left Rosie with the neighbor, saying he had some work to take care of and promising he'd be back before lunch. She was still worn down from the day before, her green eyes missing their usual light, but she nodded obediently and hugged Mr. Buttons to her chest as if the teddy bear were the only lifeline in a vast sea. Ethan kissed his daughter's forehead, breathed in the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo, and wondered if this might be the last time he ever got to do that. Then he drove to Rosa's cafe, where Clara was opening up alone in the red-tinged dawn. She stood there in a white apron with her brown hair tied up high, wiping down tables with the automatic movements of someone who hadn't slept enough. When the doorbell rang and she looked up to see Ethan, her hazel eyes widened for a second before settling again. She didn't ask why he was there so early. She simply poured a cup of black coffee and set it in front of him when he sat at the counter. "Thank you," Ethan said, but he didn't touch the coffee. Instead, he looked straight into Clara's eyes, and she immediately knew this wasn't an ordinary conversation. "I need to ask you for something," he said, his voice low and serious, "and I need you not to ask why." Clara set the cloth aside, placed both hands on the counter, and faced him with a calm Ethan hadn't expected from someone who'd witnessed violence just the day before. "I'm listening. If anything happens to me," Ethan said slowly, weighing each word as if it carried the weight of stone, "could you stay with Rosie, just until someone comes to get her? There will be someone I trust, but in the meantime, I need to know she won't be alone." Clara was silent for a long moment. Outside, the sun climbed higher, turning the cafe's white curtains gold. Somewhere in the kitchen, the coffee machine hummed softly, like the heartbeat of a house waking up. "Why me?" Clara asked at last, her tone not resistant, only quietly curious. "You don't know anything about me." "I know the way you look at her," Ethan replied. "I know the way she looks at you. Rosie hasn't spoken to strangers since her mother died. You're the first person she's opened up to in 3 years. That's enough for me." Clara looked down at her hands, and Ethan saw her unconsciously tug the leather bracelet lower, hiding whatever lay beneath it. "Do you know why I understand hurt children?" she asked, her voice light as breath. "Because I was one of them." Ethan didn't speak. He waited. "I didn't have parents," Clara continued, her gaze drifting toward the window but truly fixed on the past. "I grew up in the foster system. 13 homes in 16 years. Some were good, some weren't." She touched the bracelet. The last one wasn't good. "My foster father thought violence was discipline. I ran away at 16, lived on the streets for 2 years before I managed to stand on my own." She looked back at Ethan, and in her hazel eyes he saw scars that mirrored his own. Different shapes, different origins, the same kind of pain. "I know what it's like to have no one," Clara said, "and I don't want any child to feel that way. Not even for a second. If you need me to be there for Rosie, I will be. No explanations needed." Something loosened in Ethan's chest, something he hadn't realized he was holding tight. "Thank you." Clara tilted her head, a small smile touching her lips. "But you have to promise me one thing." "What's that?" "You have to come back, because Rosie needs her father, not a temporary babysitter." She hesitated, then added, "And because I've just gotten used to a customer who drinks his coffee black with no sugar. Those are rare." Ethan almost laughed, and that surprised him. With everything closing in, with the darkness drawing near, this woman still found a way to make him want to smile. Catherine had been right. Sometimes the best things came from the least expected places. "I promise," he said, and this time he truly believed it. Raymond Brooks was already waiting at the abandoned warehouse on the edge of town when Ethan arrived that afternoon. The 50-year-old man with salt and pepper hair and eyes sharp as blades looked no different than he had 3 years earlier, still wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, still standing straight as an old oak, still carrying a gaze that could read every hidden corner of a man's soul. When Ethan stepped through the rusted steel door, Raymond only nodded once, as if they had seen each other the week before, instead of after 3 years of silence that had felt permanent. Behind Raymond stood 5 other men, faces Ethan remembered from the height of his reign. Men who had been willing to die for him and had proven it more than once. They stood in the dim light filtering through shattered windows, and when they saw Ethan enter, they bowed their heads like knights welcoming their king home from a long and brutal campaign. No one spoke. There was no need. The silent king was back, and the kingdom awaited orders. "Castellano has known you're alive for 6 months," Raymond began, his voice steady and professional. "He's planted watchers in every small town along the East Coast, looking for any sign of you. Derek Vance was his piece here, paid to confirm and provoke." Ethan nodded, unsurprised. "What else?" "Castellano has been rebuilding for 3 years. After you disappeared, he took most of our East Coast territory. He's got around 50 men now, and he's staying at an estate outside the city, about 3 hours from here." Raymond handed Ethan a thick folder. "He thinks you've grown weak after hiding for 3 years. He thinks you ran because you were afraid. He doesn't know you were just waiting for the right reason to come back." Ethan flipped through the pages, studying maps of the estate, guard positions, Castellano's movements. Raymond was as meticulous as ever, missing nothing. One of our own betrayed us, Raymond added, his voice dropping. Marco. He's the one who told Castellano you might still be alive. He thinks I don't know, but I've been watching him for 6 months. Ethan paused, his jaw tightening. Marco, the boy he had pulled off the streets at 15, the one he had treated like a younger brother. Betrayal always came from those closest. He had learned that lesson long ago, and it still hurt. Leave Marco here, Ethan said at last. I'll deal with him later. Right now, Castellano is the priority. Raymond nodded. What's your plan? I go alone. All 5 men lifted their heads, protest written across their faces, but Raymond raised a hand to stop them. Go on, boss. Castellano is expecting an army, Ethan explained. He's prepared for a war. He isn't prepared for a ghost. I'll go in alone, finish him, and disappear before anyone understands what happened. If you all go, there'll be a war. There'll be blood. Some of you might not come back. I won't have that. Raymond studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. You're still as stubborn as ever. All right. We'll stay here, watch over your daughter, and wait for you to come back. Ethan walked to the steel trunk in the corner of the warehouse that Raymond had prepared at his request. Inside were the things he hadn't touched in 3 years. A perfectly tailored black suit, not the flashy kind worn by showy mobsters, but the kind worn by a man who knew how to disappear into darkness. A fully assembled and loaded handgun, a dagger with a black blade that reflected no light, and a pair of black leather gloves he had worn on hundreds of missions before. Ethan changed in silence, every movement precise and familiar, as if he had never left this world at all. When he finished and looked into the cracked mirror on the wall, the man staring back was no longer Ethan Cross, the mechanic from Millbrook. It was the Silent King, ruler of the shadows, the man who had built an empire on blood and silence, the man Catherine had loved and tried to redeem, the father willing to become a monster to protect his child. Before leaving, Ethan sat at the old wooden table and took out a sheet of paper and a pen. He wrote slowly, each word heavy as stone. My dearest Rosie, he began. If you're reading this, it means I didn't keep my promise to come back. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm sorry for everything I couldn't tell you, for the secrets I kept, for the explanations I owed you. I'm not a superhero. I'm a man who's done many wrong things in his life, things I hope you'll never have to know. But there's one thing I did right, and that's loving you. You're the reason I wake up every morning. You're the reason I learned how to become better. You're the best thing I ever made in this world. Your mom will be watching over you from above, and wherever I am, I'll always love you. Your dad. Ethan folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and handed it to Raymond. If I don't come back before dawn, give this to Rosie, and make sure Clara Ashford is with her. She'll know what to do. Raymond took the letter, his face unreadable but his eyes saying everything. You'll come back, boss. Ethan didn't answer. He simply walked out the door, into the darkness waiting for him, and vanished as if he had never existed. Frank Castellano's estate sat deep within a pine forest outside the suburbs, 3 hours north of Millbrook. A crescent moon hung low, washing red roof tiles and bone-white walls in pale light, casting long black shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. 12 guards patrolled outside, 6 inside, and Castellano himself was on the 2nd floor in a study with windows overlooking the pool. Ethan had observed from a distance for an hour, memorizing every movement pattern, every blind spot, every shift change that left a 15-second gap at the eastern gate. 15 seconds was more than enough. He moved like water through stone, like wind through a cracked door, like death arriving without sound. The first guard went down without ever understanding what happened, a strike to the back of the neck from behind, precise at the point that shut the body down without causing permanent damage. Ethan dragged the unconscious man into the bushes and kept moving. The second guard was smoking at the corner of the yard, the red glow of the cigarette the last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him. The third and fourth patrolled as a pair. Ethan waited until they turned into a blind corner, then handled both within 3 seconds. One hand sealing the mouth of the first while his leg swept the second off balance, then a seamless switch and 2 thunderous blows to the temples. One by one, the ghost passed through the estate, leaving a trail of bodies breathing but unmoving behind him. No gunshots, no screams, only lethal silence and the faint scent of blood in the night air. When Ethan reached the door of Castellano's study, all 12 outside guards and 5 of the 6 inside lay still on the floor. He stood before the intricately carved oak door, drew a deep breath, then pushed it open and stepped inside as if he owned the place. Frank Castellano sat behind a walnut desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and a waiting smile on his lips. He was 55, with silver white hair slicked back and eyes cold as a serpent's, dressed in an expensive gray suit, as though preparing for a gala rather than facing his sworn enemy. "I knew you'd come," Castellano said, his voice disturbingly calm. "The only question was why it took you 3 years." Ethan stood 10 paces away, gray eyes locked on the man. "Because I thought if I died, you'd leave my daughter alone." Castellano laughed, the sound like stones grinding together. "You killed my brother, because your brother shot my wife." Castellano's eyes flickered with something resembling false regret. "That was an accident. You were the target, not her. But you hid too well, and your beautiful wife happened to be in the wrong place at the right time." Rage surged in Ethan's chest like a volcanic eruption, but he forced it down, keeping his hands steady and his voice even. His throat tightened as Catherine's body flashed through his mind, her blood on the pavement, Rosie crying herself to sleep night after night, 3 years of grief and running. "You owe me a life," Ethan said. "I'm here to collect." Castellano tilted his head, the smile never leaving. "Do you know who told me you were still alive?" "I don't need to guess. Derek Vance." Castellano shook his head. "Derek was just a pawn. The one who convinced me was one of your own, one of the men you trusted most." He reached into a drawer, pulled out a photograph, and slid it across the desk. The image showed Marco shaking hands with Derek Vance in a bar, the grin on his face, the grin of a traitor well paid. "He came to me 6 months ago," Castellano continued. "Said he knew where you were, and he was willing to hand you over if I gave him a place in my organization. Turns out loyalty from your people is worth $500,000 and a promise of promotion." Ethan stared at the photograph, the sensation like an invisible blade driven straight through his chest. Marco, the boy he had pulled off the streets at 15, the one he'd raised like a younger brother, the one he'd trusted enough to know his new location. Betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. But Ethan had lived long enough in darkness to know pain changed nothing, only action did. "That won't save you," he said, his voice ice cold. Castellano raised an eyebrow. "That's fine. I don't need saving. I just need you dead." He pressed a button beneath the desk, and the door behind Ethan flew open. Marco stepped in, gun raised, aimed squarely at Ethan's back. "Sorry, boss," Marco said, his voice trembling slightly though his grip was steady. "But you didn't pay enough for me to die for you." Ethan didn't turn around. He closed his eyes for a single second, drew a breath, then opened them and moved. In the instant, Marco hesitated, waiting for a reaction. Ethan spun, his right hand knocking the gun barrel aside as the shot rang out, the bullet grazing his shoulder and slamming into the wall. His left hand crushed Marco's wrist, sending the weapon clattering away, and his knee drove hard into the traitor's stomach. Marco folded, and Ethan brought his elbow down on the back of his neck, ending it in 3 seconds. "I forgive you," Ethan said to the unconscious body at his feet, "but I don't forget." When he turned back, Castellano had pulled a gun from the drawer and was aiming at him, but his hands were shaking. Ethan advanced, slow and steady, like inevitable death. Castellano fired, the bullet missing by inches as his hands trembled too violently. Ethan didn't stop. Castellano fired again, this time missing by more. Ethan kept coming. When Ethan stood directly in front of him, the gun clicked empty, and Castellano shook like a leaf in a storm. "Please," Castellano whispered, all arrogance gone, replaced by the raw terror of a man about to die. "I have money. I have power. I can give you anything." Ethan tilted his head, and in that moment he wasn't a monster. He was a husband claiming justice for his wife, a father protecting his child. "The only thing I want," Ethan said, "is for you to never be able to threaten my daughter again." A single gunshot shattered the night, and the silent king left the estate the way he had entered, without a sound, leaving only silence and death behind him. Dawn painted the horizon red as Ethan drove into the familiar street of Millbrook. Early light streamed through the windshield, revealing his exhausted face with a dark bruise on his cheek and a shallow cut running along his left arm where Marco's bullet had grazed him. The blood had dried into dark brown streaks on the sleeve of his black suit, but Ethan didn't feel the pain. He felt nothing except the strange emptiness of a man who had completed a task he never wanted to carry out. Castellano was dead. As for Marco, Raymond had ensured the young man was stripped of his rank and sent far away under heavy watch, banished from the underworld forever as a final, mercy-filled command from the king, who refused to shed the blood of someone he once called a brother. The threat was gone, but it didn't bring Catherine back. It didn't erase the 3 years Rosie had grown up without her mother. Victory tasted far more bitter than Ethan had imagined. He parked in front of his small house and sat there for a moment, watching the warm yellow light spilling from the living room window. Someone was still awake. Someone was still waiting for him. When Ethan opened the door and stepped inside, Clara was sitting on the sofa with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands. She was still wearing her cafe uniform, proof that she had come straight from her shift and stayed all night. Her hazel eyes widened when she saw him, taking in the injuries on his face and arm. But she didn't scream or panic. She simply stood, stepped closer, and spoke softly. "You came back. I promised I would," Ethan replied, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Where's Rosie?" "Sleeping in her room." Clara glanced at his arm. "She stayed up most of the night waiting for you. I had to read her stories 4 times before she finally slept. Thank you." Ethan wanted to say more, wanted to explain, wanted to apologize for pulling her into this chaos, but there were no words that were enough. Clara seemed to understand. She nodded once and stepped back. "You need to clean and bandage that arm. But first, go see your daughter. She needs you more than anyone right now." Ethan crossed the living room, each step heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Rosie's bedroom door was slightly open, a star-shaped nightlight casting soft specks of light across the ceiling. His daughter lay curled on the bed. Mister. Buttons clutched tightly in her arms. Blonde hair spread across the pillow like rays of sunlight. He knelt beside the bed, gently brushed her hair, and Rosie opened her eyes almost instantly, as if she had been waiting all night for this moment. Her green eyes found him, and for a brief second they widened in fear when she saw the bruise on his face. "Daddy," Rosie whispered, her voice trembling. "You're hurt." "It's okay, Angel," Ethan said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Just a scratch. I'm home now. I'm not going anywhere." Rosie sat up and wrapped her arms around his neck with all the strength of a 6-year-old child, her small hands gripping tight as if he might disappear if she let go. Ethan held his daughter, breathed in the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo, felt her small heart pounding against his chest. And then, for the first time in 3 years, for the first time since he had knelt beside Catherine's coffin, for the first time in front of his child, Ethan cried. Not loud sobs, but silent tears sliding down his cheeks and into Rosie's blonde hair. They were tears of 3 years of restraint, of grief for a wife he had never allowed himself to mourn, of terror that he might never hold his daughter again. They were the tears of a father finally allowing himself to be weak. "Daddy," Rosie pulled back slightly, green eyes fixed on the tears on his face with concern. "Are you crying? Are you scared?" "Yes, sweetheart," Ethan admitted, his voice breaking. "I was scared. I was scared of losing you. I was scared I wouldn't come home to you." Rosie lifted her small hand and wiped his tears, clumsy but full of love. "It's okay, Daddy. You're home now. Mommy told me in my dream that you'd come back. Mommy never lies." Ethan looked at his daughter, a 6-year-old child comforting the man who once ruled the underworld, and felt his heart melt completely. "You're right," he whispered. "Mommy never lies." They stayed there, father and daughter, in the gentle glow of the star-shaped nightlight, holding each other until the sun climbed higher and birds began to sing outside the window. Clara stood quietly in the doorway, watching them with damp eyes, then turned away to make a fresh pot of coffee. Outside, the town of Millbrook woke to a new day, and inside the small house at the edge of town, a family was beginning to heal. A few days after the night Ethan came home, when the wound on his arm had begun to heal and the bruise on his cheek had faded to a pale yellow, he and Rosie sat together in the backyard in the late afternoon. The sunset bathed the small lawn in gold, along with the wooden swing Ethan had built for his daughter 2 years earlier. Rosie sat on her father's lap. "Mister," buttons carefully placed on her knees, her green eyes lifted to his with the seriousness of a child waiting for answers to questions far too big for her age. "Daddy," she began, her voice light like falling leaves, "were you a bad person before?" Ethan took a deep breath and looked into his daughter's eyes, Catherine's eyes, waiting for the truth. He had known this conversation would come, had prepared for it over the past few days, yet it didn't make it any easier. "I did bad things," he said slowly, choosing each word with care. "But I don't think I was a bad person, sweetheart. I was someone who made a lot of mistakes, so many mistakes, and I've been trying to fix them for a long time." Rosie tilted her head, her small brows knitting together as she tried to understand. Did Mommy know? Mommy knew everything. Ethan nodded, a sad smile touching his lips as he thought of Catherine. She knew who I was. She knew what I'd done. And she still loved me. She once told me something I'll never forget. What did she say? She said I was like a dragon. Rosie's eyes widened, curiosity replacing seriousness. A dragon? Like in fairy tales? Yes, but not a bad dragon that steals princesses. Ethan stroked her hair, his voice gentle as if telling a bedtime story. Mommy said I was a dragon who chose to stop breathing fire. Do you understand? The dragon still has fire inside. It's still dangerous if it wants to be, but it chooses not to burn everything anymore. Instead, it uses the warmth of that fire to keep the people it loves safe. Rosie was quiet for a moment, processing the idea in the way only a 6-year-old could. Then she smiled, bright as sunshine after rain. So you're my dragon, and I'm your princess. That's right, Angel. Ethan laughed softly, his heart warming as he realized his daughter wasn't afraid of him or pulling away after everything that had happened. You're my princess, and I'll use that warmth to keep you safe forever. Rosie held out her tiny pinky finger in front of him. Promise, Daddy. Promise you won't turn into a bad dragon. Ethan looked at her small finger, then into her green eyes, waiting so earnestly. He hooked his pinky around hers, the small gesture that to Rosie was more sacred than any contract or oath in the adult world. I promise, he said. I promise I'll never turn into a bad dragon. I'll only be a dragon who knows how to keep others warm, a dragon who protects his princess. But I can't promise I'll be perfect, Rosie. Sometimes I'll make mistakes. Sometimes I'll hurt you without meaning to. But I promise I'll always be here. I'll always love you, and I'll always try to be a better dad every day. Rosie nodded solemnly, as if she had just heard an important speech. Okay, Daddy, but you have to promise one more thing. What is it, sweetheart? You have to promise you won't leave me again. Last time you were gone a long time, and I was scared. Ethan's heart tightened at her words. He pulled his daughter close, resting his chin on the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo. I promise, he whispered. I won't leave you again. No matter what happens, I'll always find my way back to you, because you're my home. Rosie looked up, a radiant smile on her face. I promise I won't leave you either. Me and Mr. Buttons will stay with you forever. They sat there until the sun disappeared completely, and the first stars appeared in the sky. The dragon and his princess, together in the fading light, bound by a pinky promise and a love that didn't need words. 1 week after the conversation with Rosie in the garden, Ethan came to Rosa's cafe late in the evening, when the last customers had already left. Clara was wiping down the bar by herself. Rosa had gone home long ago, and the soft yellow lights cast a warm halo over her brown hair. She looked up at the sound of the door chime and smiled when she saw Ethan step inside, the smile pausing slightly when she noticed the seriousness on his face. He sat at the bar in the same spot as the last time he had come to ask her to watch Rosie, and Clara placed a cup of black coffee in front of him without asking. I owe you an explanation, Ethan began, his voice low and steady. You've done so much for my family without asking for anything, and you deserve to know the truth. Clara set the cloth down and took the chair across from him, her brown eyes meeting his without fear. Then tell me. And Ethan told her. He told her everything, without avoidance, without excuses, only the bare and cold truth like a winter night. He told her about the Silent King, about the underground empire he had built on blood and silence, about the ruthless decisions he had made when he was young and arrogant. He told her about Catherine, the woman who had seen the man inside the monster and loved him enough to change him. He told her about her death, about 3 years of running, about Castellano and the night he returned to his old world to end it all. He hid nothing. No darkness was covered. No sin justified. When he finished, silence stretched between them like a fragile bridge spanning an abyss. Ethan waited for judgment, waited for fear, waited for Clara to stand up and walk out of his life the way any normal woman would after learning she had been sitting across from a killer. But Clara didn't do that. She simply looked at him for a long moment, then slowly lifted her hand and removed the leather bracelet from her left wrist. Beneath it was an old burn scar, the skin wrinkled and discolored, running from her wrist almost to her elbow. This is a souvenir from someone who was supposed to protect me, she said, her voice calm with a faint tremor beneath it. My foster father thought violence was the way to teach a 14-year-old girl obedience. He was wrong. And I've carried this scar for 13 years as a reminder that the people who are supposed to love you are sometimes the ones who hurt you the most. Ethan looked at the scar and felt the pain it represented, understanding that Clara was no stranger to darkness. She had lived in it in her own way, been wounded in her own way, and survived in her own way. "I'm not afraid of your past," Clara continued, her eyes steady on his. "I'm afraid of the future. I'm afraid of loving someone and losing them. I'm afraid of opening my heart and getting hurt again. I've built walls around my heart for years, and now I don't know how to tear them down." Ethan reached out slowly, as if approaching a frightened bird, and gently touched the scar on her wrist. Clara didn't pull away. She took a soft breath and let him touch it, let him feel what she had endured. "I'm afraid too," he admitted. "I'm afraid I don't deserve happiness after everything I've done. I'm afraid the darkness will come back and swallow the people I care about. I'm afraid to love again because losing Catherine almost destroyed me." He looked up at her, and in that moment, two people with different scars but the same kind of pain found each other in the quiet cafe. "Then can we be afraid together?" Clara asked, her voice light as breath. "Instead of being afraid alone, we're afraid together. And maybe that way, little by little, we won't be so afraid anymore." Ethan took her hand, his calloused fingers weaving into her softer ones, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than pain when he thought about the future. "I want to try," he said, "if you'll let me." Clara smiled, and for the first time her smile carried no guard at all, only fragile but real hope. "I'll let you." 6 months passed like a dream Ethan didn't dare believe was real. Clara had moved in with him and Rosie in the small house on the edge of Millbrook, not because of a rushed proposal or an impulsive decision, but because everything unfolded as naturally as water following its course. She started by staying for dinner, then staying to read to Rosie, then staying overnight when the rain poured hard, and one day Ethan realized her toothbrush was in the bathroom, her clothes were hanging in the closet, and her laughter had become the most familiar sound in the house. They didn't rush to name their relationship or force definitions on it. They simply stayed together, learning to love slowly, like two people who had been hurt too deeply to hurry. Clara finished her early childhood education degree and began working at Rosie's school, which meant she walked Rosie to class every morning and picked her up every afternoon while Ethan worked at the repair shop. Raymond helped him convert what remained of the old empire's money into a quiet, charitable fund, supporting children in the foster care system. Children like Clara once was. That was how Ethan sought redemption without anyone knowing except Raymond and Clara. On Saturday mornings, the three of them sat at Rosa's cafe like an unbreakable ritual. Rosie was teaching Clara how to stack marshmallows into the shape of a little house in her cup of hot chocolate, her green eyes shining as she explained every detail with the seriousness of an architect. "Miss Clara, you have to put this one here. This is Mr. Buttons' room. He needs his own room because he likes afternoon naps." Clara laughed and followed her instructions with endless patience. "Yes, Chief Architect. Are there any other rooms?" Ethan sat across from them, a cup of black coffee in his hands, watching the two women in his life with a heart full of something he thought he'd lost the ability to feel. Happiness, peace, hope. Rosie suddenly stopped in the middle of placing a marshmallow, her eyes fixed on the chocolate with an unusual thoughtfulness for a 6-year-old. Then she looked up at Clara and asked in a clear voice like a bell, "Miss Clara, can you be my new mom?" The air in the cafe seemed to freeze. Clara went still, her brown eyes widening, the cup in her hand stopping halfway to her lips. Ethan felt his heart skip, then race faster than it ever had. "I know my first mom is in heaven," Rosie continued, her voice calm in a way that suggested she'd been thinking about this for a long time. "Daddy says Mommy's watching me from above and she loves me very much, but Mommy's far away, and I can't hug her. Miss Clara is here, and I can hug her. And I think Mommy wouldn't be sad if I had another mom here, right, Daddy?" Ethan looked at Clara, and Clara looked back at him. In that moment, 1,000 unnecessary words passed between them in silence. He saw the surprise in her eyes, the emotion, the familiar fear of someone not used to being loved, but he also saw hope, longing, and love for the child waiting for an answer. "No, Angel," Ethan said softly, his voice thick. "Mommy wouldn't be sad. She'd be very happy." Clara turned back to Rosie, her eyes shimmering with tears while her lips curved into the brightest smile Ethan had ever seen on her face. "I'd love to be your new mom," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. "If you and your dad will let me." Rosie squealed with joy and threw herself into Clara's arms. Mr. Buttons caught between them, the cup of chocolate nearly spilling before Ethan caught it just in time. He watched them holding each other, and he knew this was home, not 4 walls and a roof, but 3 hearts beating in the same rhythm. 1 year after the day, Rosie asked Clara if she could be her new mom. Autumn returned to the town of Millbrook with red and golden leaves drifting softly on the breeze, and a sky so clear it looked like polished crystal. In the backyard of their small home, a simple wedding took place beneath an old oak tree, where Ethan had hung white ribbons and wildflowers. Rosie had picked herself from the nearby field. There were no hundreds of guests, no expensive bouquets, no designer gown. There was only Rosa in the front row with tears glistening in her eyes, Raymond in a black suit standing beside Ethan as his witness, and a handful of close friends from the small town who had become family over the years. Clara wore a simple white dress, her hair loose with a few small flowers woven in, and she walked barefoot across the grass because she said she wanted to feel the earth beneath her feet on the most important day of her life. Rosie walked ahead as the flower girl, holding a small basket of petals, with Mr. Buttons wearing a white bow around his neck as the guest of honor. When Clara stood before Ethan under the oak tree, he took her hands and began to read the vows he had written over many sleepless nights. "I can't promise to be perfect," he said, his voice low and trembling with emotion. "I've done terrible things in my life, and I'll carry those memories until my last breath. But I promise to spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of you and Rosie. I promise to use my strength only to shield this family, ensuring that the light in our home is never threatened by the shadows I once ruled. I promise to love you with everything I am, including the broken parts and the scars." Clara smiled through her tears and spoke her own vows. "I don't need you to be perfect. I need you here. I need you real. And I love your scars, because they prove you survived, that you fought, that you chose to become better. I promise to be afraid with you, to heal with you, and to build a home with you, no matter what that home looks like." They exchanged rings, kissed beneath the falling golden leaves, and Rosie squealed with joy before running forward to wrap her arms around both of them. That evening, after the guests had gone home and the house had grown quiet again, the three of them sat on the porch watching 1,000 stars glitter across the night sky. Rosie had fallen asleep in Ethan's arms, one hand still holding Mr. Buttons, her blonde hair spread across his chest like rays of sunlight. Clara rested her head on his shoulder, her breathing soft and steady, her fingers interlaced with his like two final pieces that had finally found their place. Ethan looked up at the sky, where the stars shimmered like diamonds scattered on black velvet, and whispered to Catherine wherever she might be, "I kept my promise. Our daughter is safe, she's happy, and I found my way home. You were right when you said I could become better. You were always right. Thank you for loving me, for believing in me, for giving me Rosie. I'll never forget you. But I've learned that loving someone new doesn't mean betraying the one you lost. It means your heart is big enough to hold it all." A gentle wind passed through, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and flowers, and Ethan could swear he heard Catherine's laughter in the breeze, a sound that told him she was smiling at them from somewhere far away, but never truly gone. Ethan Mercer had been many things in his life: a king of darkness, a killer in the shadows, a ghost moving through the underworld leaving deadly silence behind. He had done terrible things for reasons he once believed were justified, and he carried those memories like stones in his pockets, always present, never forgotten. But the only titles that mattered to him now were the ones Rosie and Clara had given him: father, husband, home. That was enough. It would always be enough. The Silent King had found a new kind of power, one that didn't require fear or blood, and his heart had never burned brighter with a sense of peace. This story reminds us that no one is trapped forever in their past. No matter what you've done, no matter who you once were, you can always choose to become a better version of yourself. True love has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. And family doesn't have to mean shared blood, but the people who choose to stand beside you in your hardest moments. Real strength isn't found in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to love, to forgive, and to begin again. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss future emotional stories. Don't forget to like and share this video with the people you love to spread its message. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever struggled between your past and your present, between who you were and who you want to become? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd truly love to hear what's in your heart. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. Wishing you and your family good health, happiness, and days filled with love and peace. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.